Soon will come to the end of life's journey, and perhaps we'll never meet anymore, together in heaven's bright city, far away on that beautiful shore. If we ever meet, soon will come to the end of life's journey, and perhaps we'll never meet anymore, till we gather in heaven's bright city, far away on that beautiful shore. If we ever meet side by
She can trump him. Good morning, everybody. So, yeah, the elephant in the room is my broke arm. So yeah, I mean, I've been mountain biking since forever, 2005 or four, and at least I'm spacing out the breaks over a number of years, and it seems to always be on my left arm, and I'm left-handed, so that's real convenient. But I tell you what, I'll just say it because I know, and over the past, some people, they're like, well, it's too dangerous. You're going to get hurt. Well, yeah, I could slip in the bathroom and get hurt too. I'd rather be out exercising and doing something I enjoy and get hurt. But anyway, it's okay. Just have to readjust a few things. So this morning, it's good to see everybody. We'll see how everybody's getting online. We're getting some people here. Um, yeah, we're continuing this great study on the apologetics, and today we're going to tackle kind of what I call the big one, the one that really everybody, tends to use to try to debunk the existence of God. And initially, when Darwin in the 1850s came up with this, and you think about that, now I think it's 1854 when he wrote his book on evolution, and well, I don't think that's the title of the book, but when he came up with that, it it was not accepted. It was something that everybody understood, or they believed that there was a creator, that there was somebody behind the design, and many of the things like this. And then Darwin, through his observation of finches and different animals, noticed that there was a progressive change within these animals, and then started digging deeper and developed this hypothesis of believing that, well, maybe everybody just, all the organisms have somehow developed further and further, and became better and better and better over all these millions of years, and tried to link it to fossils. That didn't work. The fossil records don't support it. And I think that the more that we got into science and understanding many of the unseen things, that our society also became more and more immoral, and they started looking more to science and kind of walking away from God. And in that progress, it just, Darwinism became stronger and came to a head in America, where it is now really overtaken the idea that there's a God, and that God, a designer. Well, let's just don't even call him a God. I mean, just if you just understand that there is a designer, and that's what we looked at in our previous classes, was looking at this idea of it. So creation versus evolution. So I want to look at good morning, Lacey. I want to look at the definition and read it, because I think that looking at it as this is coming from Darwinism and the way they think about it. So the first, looking at evolution, this is their belief. Universe is self-contained, which means that everything in the universe has come into being through random process without any kind of supernatural involvement. The origin and development of the universe and all the life in it can be explained by time, chance, continuing natural processes. All living things have arisen from a single cell organism, which in turn has arisen from something non-living, such as an amino acid or protein. So, self-contained, the universe, it was one source of matter, particles, whatever. If you tie this then into what they call the Big Bang, that there was a singularity event, a single event, where all of this material was condensed, highly condensed into one place. The singularity event is one where at some point that all of this matter and energy released. Something triggered it and started this explosion, in a sense, or rapid expansion, or inflation is another term you'll hear, where it just started to go outward. And this is where you've heard me say, it's like going down to a hardware store, or like a big Home Depot or Lowe's, where you have all the material there in one spot, one address where Lowe's is. And then you just take some dynamite and you have an event. Well, Lowe's, we know, would not just blow up. Something would have to cause Lowe's to explode to make that event. That's the first problem. What caused something that was initially in a state that was condensed to then all of a sudden become unstable and then explode outwardly? So that would be like the Lowe's sitting there, all the parts to a house, all the components to a house, all concentrated at that one address. Somehow, the Lowe's explodes. Now, we send in fire investigators, don't we, to figure it out, go in and see, was it the gas, was it this, was it electrical? But we don't know. That's the problem. Scientists do not know what caused it. They have theories, but nobody's witnessed it. That's the key thing with science. You have to be able to observe. So they've never been able to observe this event. And then all those elements explode and go out. And as they go out, it's all self-contained. And that's part of this evolution is the universe is self-contained. And that's that initial singularity moment where everything was together. And there's no more energy, no less. So after the explosion, nothing new was created. All was still there. And all that's out there right now is still the same amount in just a different location, all over the place, infinite. And it came through a random process, no order. That's kind of like the explosion. There's nothing orderly about a rapid release of energy. There's no order to it. So that fits with what they believe in random process without a trigger. That's what he's saying here in evolution is without any supernatural involvement, because it would have to be above what's natural. And at the singularity moment, when all was one massive clump, something had to be outside of that clump of energy and dense mass, something super normal, because normal at the very beginning, according to them, was this clump of just particles and stuff. So they believe it was something internal within what existed, which is nothingness, because it's all just atoms and molecules and hydrogen and carbon and all that. That's it. So something just spontaneously released. So that's a part of the evolution. It says without any kind of supernatural origin. And then it developed. The origin, the beginning, and the universe develops on its own. And life, organisms. So not only the material that's inorganic, dirt, rocks, asteroids, things like that, but also then life, organisms. So the two together is and this is why evolution very much fits exactly with the scientific thought, I do not believe it, but scientific thought that somehow we had a singularity moment that exploded, universe scatters out there, gets very organized, and all of a sudden develops life. Yeah, my eyebrows rolled. I'm trying not to be too sarcastic because I want you to understand what their thinking is and understand where's the logic to it. So they say, and this is evolution as well, it can be explained by time, chance, and just a continuing natural process. So natural, now this is what's interesting about natural. Let's bring that into the scientific world. Natural would be able to be described by things that fit within the laws of thermodynamics. The laws of thermodynamics. They're the fundamental principles of natural observation and description of things that are happening. So everything that is occurring in the universe as we know it anyway until they develop. And I just read recently that Hawkins' theory on black holes he had predicted, he had a theory in 1971, and just recently they confirmed it, but now it's throwing into jeopardy some of the other logic. So it's like science now is against science. But they still agree, they still at least today agree that the laws of thermodynamics are the basis of everything in the universe. If you see something, it fits within those laws of thermodynamics. But that's order. Even then, if you can see that, how did that come about? How did those happen? So but they say it's by chance. And it's a natural process. Natural and chaotic. Is chaos natural? Well, I guess so, if you put it into motion. And then all living things come from one single organism, which again, if you go back to the Big Bang and everything started at one molecular little condensed ball, everything did start. But then it's arisen from something non-living. Here, this is important. That something that's living came from something that's non-living. Remember that, because when we get into the class, we're going to see where that is that's a contradiction of science's own understanding. So, when we come to creation, the universe is not self-contained. Why do we believe that? Because there's a God. We believe there's a supernatural, something that's creating things super above everything that's existence. That's supernatural. Everything in the universe has come into being through design, purpose, and deliberate acts of a supernatural creator who, using processes that are not continuing today, created the universe, the earth, and all the life on the earth, including basic types of plants, animals, as well as humans. So let's look. The universe is not self-contained. There's something above the initial created material that we see, which then means that there was something outside of that, which would be above nature, outside of nature, which is supernatural. I know I'm kind of talking, maybe I'm not trying to talk down, but I'm trying to keep it to where you can understand what supernatural from natural is. Natural would be something that's normal. Normal is the physical world and all the materials. Something outside of that exists beyond that is supernatural. So something supernatural created. There's a creator that was outside of the bounds of the laws of thermodynamics and everything else. Key point, used a process that is not in being today. It's not continuing today. He used the process, this supernatural creator, to then bring forward everything and create it, but is not continuing that process. Remember this as well. That's a very important point, because as we start to look at other geological formations, we start to look at other things that are happening, the creation of diamonds, oil, and all these things. These are all processes that initially started and happened, but does not mean it's the same. That's the other fallacy, is thinking that somehow that process that we are living in now, whatever process to create things and age and go on, has always been the same. And it hasn't, because from the moment of creation, that was a very unique process when he created the world. And so that's a part of the creation theory, is that it is not continuing today. It created, and the universe came into existence, the earth came into existence, all life came into existence, and that unique process stopped. So, and including everything, organic and inorganic. So now, if we're going to use the same approach and the same logic as scientists, people who do not believe in God, agnostics, let's apply what they use, and it's called the scientific models. When you go through the scientific method, you have to be consistent, and that's something where we'll I hope you'll be able to see in comparing the two. I'm not going to put it through. I'm not going to go through the scientific step by step by step by step. If you want, you can look that up and stuff, but this is kind of the summary for time's sake of looking at it so that you can grasp the bigger picture here. If you were to take and put them into both creation and evolution through the scientific process and establish a scientific model for evolution, scientific model for creation, and evaluate. Because see, that's the thing that our public schools are saying as well, is that creation is not scientific. There's no reason it should not be presented, because there's nothing about it that is scientific. It's all just feelings and theories that you can't even apply into this logical scientific process. That's wrong. That's wrong. And more today, there are more and more and more scientists and physicists to geologists to mathematicians even that are starting to say, in intelligent design, it does fit into a scientific model that's as viable, believable as evolution. So it must be defined in general terms, what you're describing, creation, evolution, and then each must be compared to available facts equally. And that's what's not happened in the recent time is from Darwinism on that it's not been equal. They have not compared the facts of both. And that's, we try to automatically assume that somehow that once you bring out those words saying creation, oh, whoa, 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 you got all religious. You got all superstitious. You got all that, religion going and God and all this. No, strip that out. We're talking creator, a designer, okay? You can call him whatever you want. If it bothers you, okay, just take the word God out, but let's look logically at this. And then you will see that there is as much evidence and credibility to a evolutionary model as there is a creation model. But again, that has been ripped out of our students' textbooks, ripped out of the colleges, and said, no, it's hokey pokey. It's not believable. But if that's true, then you need to rip out evolution as a teaching too. Because I can bring up as many credible PhDs and scientists that will say evolution is just as flawed as you guys are pointing at creation and saying it's flawed. And that's what I think is the most disturbing. There's no equality. We say that we're intelligent and that we consider all things and we're enlightened, and yet when we come down to considering for a moment that creation is a viable solution to the beginning and existence of all things, we go nuts. And the scientific enlightened people just ignore it. To me, that means you're not enlightened. If you're so incensed by the idea that creation is a viable scientific model that could explain the possibility of life and existence, and the only thing you'll accept is evolution, then you are not as enlightened as you think you are. You're not. Because I know most creationists, you should, if you're a creationist, you need to consider and evaluate evolutionary process as well. Otherwise, you're ignorant. You are just as ignorant. And that's what I think happens is when somebody cuts one from the other off and says, well, I'm not going to consider creation or I'm not going to consider evolution, you're being ignorant. You're not taking the time to consider all facts and then draw a good, sound conclusion. We know that things evolve. Knowledge evolves. Darwin even himself had some doubts and some problems with his own theory, and he believed that it would eventually become enlightened and known by certain fossils being discovered that they would be able to support his theory. But even some paleontologists at that time sent him letters. He corresponded with them and said, I'm sorry, Darwin, it doesn't work. Why don't we hear that? No, all we hear is how great evolution is. Why? Because people want to strip God out of the equation. They just want to take God out. Yeah. To me, that's not enlightenment. That's not intelligent. And when you start doing that with knowledge and stifling the other side, that's not even freedom of speech, because that's what's going on. Let people have knowledge, information, and draw their own conclusion. God has always allowed that for all of us. So that's what bothers me about when we consider that. So when we look at evolution as a model, it must show the evidence for a gradual appearance of persistent life over eons of time, with complex kinds of life emerging from simpler kinds and ultimately from non-living matter. So if we take what we had looked at earlier in the definition of evolution and we bring it into this type of process where we're going to evaluate it, it has to show this evidence for a gradual appearance, starting from nothing and slowly coming, and they're going to take eons of time. They need the billions of years. They have to have them. Because if you look at the mechanisms in which in the process and the status of life and things that are in existence now, and you count a clock backwards, you have to go back a billion years to try to get what we have today. So that's why you need these eons. And with complex kinds of life, that's what you have to have. And so that's what we have to look at is the evidence of an appearance of a life that's slowly over time with complex, going from just that simple cell, amino acids and proteins, into something extremely complex. Simpler kinds from ultimately coming from a non-living matter. That's really foundational on evolution. Because an amino acid is going, it started even before that, if you think about it. If you want to say amino acid is life or, proteins, which I disagree, but it's still, even the amino acids and the proteins came from a simpler form of material that composed that. So the foundation of this also means we need to have evidence of time, complexity of organisms, and then also coming from non-life. Creation must show the evidence for a sudden appearance of complex life. Now, if you think about that, that's hard too. Because you're going from zero to hero, boom. You're going from nothingness, complete nothingness. No condensed matter of a little ball that the evolutionists, believe that, blew up, came from absolute nothingness. Which, can you wrap your mind around that? I have a hard time wrapping my mind around that there's absolutely a nothingness period. And going from that to extremely complex life forms and design out there in the universe. Now, when I say sudden appearance, I think that sudden is relative because I believe in a 6 days creation, and I believe that as we look, if we were to go and look in Genesis, that it wasn't an instantaneous, that there was a process that was going on. It was supernatural in the way it rapidly developed and grew things and stuff like that. But so when I say that, consider it's not like a blink of the eye and bing, everything's there. I don't think that's what we're talking about in applying this. So let's look at the credibility of the the creation model. This is, I think, kind of the death nail for evolution is when we start to bring, now this law of biogenesis is something that has been developed as like the foundational law for biology, life. When we look at the law of thermodynamics, that's the one in which physicists use to look at everything and then apply that to it and explain it. When we come over to the study of life, this is one that it kind of has to fit this, or the experts and wise people in biology go, no, this is one of the large laws in biology, the law of biogenesis, that life comes only from previous life of its own kind or type, and not just spontaneous. This is a law of biogenesis, not a religious one, not, creationist type of law. But what's interesting is I watched a video actually last night where this guy goes around, he talks to different professors of different specialties, from biology to mathematics to physics, and he kept asking them about life of a different kind, a kind creating something different. And one, I don't think he understood what he was asking, because a kind is, let's just simplify it. One kind is like a dog. Another kind is a bird. Those are two different kinds when we start to categorize all life forms. A horse is a different kind in the classification of in biological life forms from a dog. But you cannot get a dog from a horse or a bird from a dog. And this one professor said, yeah, we're fish. That's a different kind. Even the law of biogenesis describes, that no, you cannot. And there's no evidence or fossil record that we have ever been able to show a link. Now, you can find something that looks the same, kind of the same. You can look at a lizard, a Tyrannosaurus rex, and you can look at a snake, and you can look at a whale's fin, And you can see some things that are common, but it was kind of like when I was in college and I tried to ask my professor, who was much smarter than me, obviously, when she was talking about evolution and about how the whale's fin was the 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 genesis of the human arm. That's where the human arm started. And if you look at the bone structure of a large whale, that fin has some unusually unique and kind of similar bone structure to an arm, but it's a fin. And she said, "Aha, see, there it is." I said, "Yeah, but that's still a fish." That and so I tried. Of course, she shut me down. I mean, I still had a grade to earn, so I was like, I don't want to make her too mad, but I just couldn't get it across. It's like I said, if I'm building a house and something good works as far as the design, a certain way that you put up your two befores, I'm going to use it throughout the house. I'm going to use it all around. If I'm an engineer and I have a certain process of engineering and building things, and I go from a car, to building a house, but there's something very good that was workable with building a car, even though they're so different, I will apply that process to everything I use because I know it's good and it works. So if there was a designer, that's what you have to admit, that designer who is designing the whale's fin says, the articulation of a certain set and organization of these bones would work in order to move water for a whale. Well, you know what? That's the same thing that would work and work really well for a human, if I was a designer, to put it on a human that would function well for him. Now, that would show that there's a unique designer. But no, strip out the designer, take God out, and say, no, it's just evolved. But there's no link. There's no fossil record. There's nothing scientific that you can sit and go, oh, there it is. Look, there's a fish, and then a fish with a human head, eventually some way down the line. And then all of a sudden this fish, he's still got the tail and gills, but then now he's got legs, and then go on. See why they need eons of time? But even with eons of time, they can't come up with any type of fossil evidence. As much as we've dug and looked, cannot find it, cannot support it at all. So it cannot. Life only comes from previous life. So a fish can adapt. And that's the key word. There is adaptation. A fish do adapt. Bears, for example, I think is one of the greatest ones I use, is like a grizzly bear to a black bear to a polar bear. But they're all the same kind. That's not evolution. That's adaptation. Completely unique and different. In nature or in the laboratory, scientists have not documented a single case of spontaneous generation. That's a fact. But that's again one of those foundational things for evolutionists that believe that somehow it's spontaneous, but they can't reproduce it. Now, what I find ironic is if you can't reproduce something, you go and you build a theory and you say that my theory is based upon this process, and you test it and you try to emulate it and it doesn't work, you don't keep beating your head against the wall. Scientists go, no, you modify your thesis and then you retest. But you see, if they acknowledge that they can't do it, it destroys the scientific theory of evolution. But see, they don't even say evolution is a theory. It's a fact to them. But it comes back again and say, well, wait a minute, put evolution back into the scientific model and process it the way you do everything else. And if you cannot make life spontaneously generate, then there's something wrong with your theory. But has anybody taught that? Does that ever get out to everybody? No. Is that put out in the public schools, in the colleges, universities? No, it's not. Why? Because they don't want to admit that there is a singular designer. Because then that would make them have to admit there's that designer. Those people called Christians call him a God. And then all the moral implications that will then tie upon it. And they don't want that. And they believe they're smarter than him, I guess. So there never has even been a single documented case of spontaneous generation. In other words, the scientists can't create it, and they've never been able to document through. And the only real thing we have would be looking at some living animals that somehow you watched it and observed it. So they couldn't create it inside a lab, couldn't redo it, haven't been able to see it in nature as far as we've ever existed. All the animals that we have, instinct animal, the ones that are gone now and all that, and you can't go back even further and look into the fossils. Never can. They can't find it. So again, why don't you reevaluate your thoughts on evolution? Now, natural selection, and I want to make this perfectly clear. Creationists believe in natural selection. Now, that sounds odd, and some people you're probably sitting there going, "Whoa, Ron, wait a minute." No, it is evident in the observable life forms that there is this process that does occur, but it is natural and orderly and a part of life. So, natural selection, let's read it. Natural selection is a daily and hourly scrutinization, every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working at the improvement of each organic being. Now, to this level, this is the evolutionist, believing that it's to that level. But we know that, for example, if going back to the bears, if we look at the genetic codes of bears, that what happened is bears in certain geographical areas started to be able to survive better than other bears. Why? Because their genetic codes had things in which that bear could survive. The process of fat, the ability to survive cold, things like this. And so natural selection did eliminate all bears in the North Pole that were black or grizzly type of genetic code bears. Those couldn't survive up there. In the same way, any bear that was a polar bear that was, in the southern part of the hemisphere didn't have the ability in its genetic code to survive. So it then also was eliminated through natural selection. So it's not that we don't believe in it, it's to the radical level in which they're saying this organized process is going on. And so it doesn't explain adaptation. That's the thing where we start to move into. Natural selection is ignoring adaptation. They're trying to say, and that the problem really, I think, is because we start to come into this really big understanding, which we're going to get to, is genetics. Because outside of really understanding genetics during Darwin's time, everything had to be explained differently. But once we start looking at why were things spontaneously developing, and then there's certain adaptations versus the elimination completely of things. So there is something. So adaptation is different from a natural selection, which is a consolidation of good, removal of bad. But we know there are certain things that have adapted and still maintain some things that you'd go, wait, it should have removed that aspect of its organism or life form. So it doesn't explain it, and that's kind of a hanging point too. Natural selection, creatures that survive as the most fit. And this is the part where I don't argue with, because we watch it. That's why the panda bears, are almost extinct, because they have to eat and survive on eating bamboo, a particular bamboo in a certain area. They cannot, if they cannot have that bamboo, they cannot survive on anything else. Guess what? They're not fit. They're removed out. They become extinct. It does not explain how those creatures became the most fit. How did those creatures, and where this comes up is what I think is interesting, is when we come into the idea of a woodpecker. I always joke, almost like a cartoon. What first bird decided that there was a worm on the other side of that wood, that if I bang my head against it long enough that I can get that worm out? how many birds did it take? I mean, wouldn't it be easier if you were a bird and you're looking and you know that there's a worm on the other side than to look down on the ground and go, you know what? There's worms in the dirt here. If I used my beak, I could just dig. But no, I'm going to bang my head against it and I'm going to die. And then the next one that comes along is going to have what? A bigger beak? I mean, what? How is it going to do this? And so there's many life forms that um, don't explain how they became the most fit. How did that one initial woodpecker get to be at the level of the modern day woodpecker? They can't explain it. Now, genetics, I believe, is one of the things that is the most important because it's not brand new, but in the 1940s and 50s, really it exploded on the scene. And I don't have my precise dates, but that's around the 1940s and 50s when we start to really start to expound upon our knowledge upon genetics and DNA. And in that, they discovered that genetic code is there's a genetic chemical code, which is comprised of information, and that in that genetic code of a particular animal, that it continues to reproduce faithfully time after time. That it happens over and over and over again. Now, anything that would change from that is called a mutation because the initial is what it's supposed to be. Any variation from the copy becomes a change or a mutation. And there are three types of mutations that we see. One is, if you look at the category of them, and this is the way they categorize these type of mutations, either they're good, neutral, or bad. Now let's go back to natural selection. In order to take this chemical code in genetics that faithfully continue to reproduce, let's say the woodpecker, that initial Genesis woodpecker had a genetic chemical code in it that kept reproducing and making the same bird. And that's the way the chemical code works. Now, something had to happen to change it to where it would start to adapt. That would be a mutation, right? It'd be a mutation. It'd be a change from the initial chemical genetic code. Now we move into the idea, okay, let's just give it credit. Okay, it mutated. But it would continue to have to mutate in order to develop to the point and continue to mutate and mutate and mutate until the woodpecker finally had the right beak, the right tongue, and everything about it. All those would be mutations because the initial genetic code is not the same. So it would fall into one of these three categories. It would either be a good mutation, a neutral mutation, or a bad mutation. And now if you look at the percentage, and this is from scientists, when they look and they study genetic chemical code mutations, they classify them in these three, and they say that if you were to look and apply this as the way evolutionists look, they would say, well, there's only one of those mutations that would help that woodpecker change his chemical code to get to where he is today, and that's good. Neutral? Well, what's that? That's in other words, it doesn't help, it doesn't hurt, but it's a change. That's not going to help. Bad? Well, that's a bad mutation is going to cause death. It's going to be detrimental to the organism, the animal. So there's only one out of the three here that would be a mutation that would help produce the adaptation necessary for that woodpecker to finally develop what he's going to do to survive. The probability of good mutations, and this is something you can look up yourself, is like 0.1% of any mutation in the chemical code of ever happening. That's the probability. It's like 0.1% of all mutations that they've seen and observed that do occur. 0.1%. The rest of them are either neutral or they're bad adaptations, which means then, according to the evolutionists, they'd be removed. So the probability starts to become even smaller and smaller that that initial bird, the great grandfather of that woodpecker, that any of his mutations would be 0.001% of ever getting there. You see why now they need eons of time? How many poor great grandfathers had to keep banging their heads to get the right chemical code to finally develop themselves to where the mutation of the probability of a good mutation would finally develop them into the woodpecker today? Yeah, it starts to get kind of overwhelming, doesn't it? So, looking at this, the genetic code with its complexity, orderliness, and function provides the most powerful evidence for intelligent design, which really requires a designer because of this complexity. Dr. Myers, Stephen Myers, we tried to look at his video. I think 2 Sundays we actually saw that video. It actually worked. But he calls it the signature in the cell. There's information, and we're saying chemical code, but that code is information. Where did the information come from? Again, the change is so probability of this information being just precise enough to tell it how to do it is almost like a Home Depot again, having information put into it. When you blew it up, it knew how to fall together in a house. Where did the information come from in our DNA? And it's as explainable as it is them trying to put evolution and say, oh, that's more probable than there's a designer. That's, I think, what's kind of disturbing to me. So we're going to do some true and false. If anybody wants to participate. So I described basically, the kind of looking at the origin of it. So true or false, the universe originated in one of 2 ways, creation or evolution. Put it this way, I don't know a third one. Aliens? No, that didn't work because somebody had to create the aliens, right? So it's true. There's only really 2 explainable reasons for the existence of everything, and it's either creation or evolution. So true or false, both evolution and creation may be called scientific models. I say true. Yes, that's the problem. They say false. They try to say creation can't be, but it can be applied just as logically and sound as any others. I'm going to kind of move through them for time. Where the creation / evolutionary issue is really insignificant and does not matter much. So this whole argument over creation and evolution, it doesn't matter much. No, it's false. It is tremendously important because it is a foundation on whether you believe that there is a designer who is God or there is nothing and there's nothingness afterwards. One, if you believe that there is a designer, indicates and the logical conclusion is there's accountability. There's a moral code. There's a designer who has the sovereign right to establish what he calls right from wrong, and which means then there's a judgment. And so if you try to say that this whole thing between understanding and evolution and the argument back and forth between creation and evolution is not important, well, it's false. It is extremely important because it's going to make a difference on your eternal soul. True or false, creation is recognized today by many scientists as a legitimate scientific concept. That is true. 40, 50 years ago, it would have been false. The majority believed in evolution. But today, you're finding that many extremely well-creditable scientists, they're being muted, though. They're being silenced. And a lot of them are losing their funding, and they're being shut down. And their published articles and their scientific studies are being silenced because the enlightened evolutionists don't want this to be out to be considered and reviewed. True or false? Lie of biogenesis says that in nature, all life comes from pre-existing life. That is true. That is a foundational law, like the law of physics and thermodynamics, that all life comes from something that's pre-existing. It doesn't come from nothing. And there's no evidence, never been able to create it or to observe where life has come from non-life. So true or false? Evolution could have occurred without spontaneous generation. Evolution could have occurred without spontaneous generation. Not according to the evolutionists. False. Evolution, according to them, they believe that it happened without spontaneous. But everything that we see is really what we should stop using the word if you're believing in creation is adaptation from an initial design, that adapts to different areas like I talked about with the bears. True or false, natural selection does not explain the creation of any new species. That is true. It does not explain. There is no explanation by just a natural process of a whole new kind that is there. Okay, that's all the time we have for class this morning. These classes are getting larger as far as the material and trying to condense them down. So I hope that we're going to have to kind of expand out the time to about a quarter after in order for me to be able to get these in. Next week, we're going to do part 2 of creation versus evolution. There's still a lot more to go. So we'll see you guys in a little bit, hopefully.